Good afternoon and welcome to our webinar, Community Engaged Research for Environmental Justice. We are all excited to have you join us today in what is our formal launch of our book, Ground Truths, Community Engaged Research for Environmental Justice. My name is Martha Matsuoka. I'm on the faculty of Urban and Environmental Policy at Occidental College, where I direct the Urban and Environmental Policy Institute, an applied research and community engaged program center on campus. I'm joined today with my friend and co-editor, Chad Raphael from Clara University, along with Julie Lucero from University of Utah and Erika Marquez from University of Nevada, Las Vegas for our very first webinar. Today, I'll share a brief overview of our book. Chad will follow with a deeper dive into the book's main themes. And then we'll turn it over to Julie and Erika to present on their chapter, The Community Engaged Research Process. We invite you to post questions using the Q&A button, and we'll respond to those questions after Julie and Erika's presentation. As you know, the webinar is recorded and we will email you the link to you afterwards. So first, I wanted to share that when Chad and I began this book project, we had 4 goals. First, we wanted to specifically focus on community engaged research, or CER, for environmental justice, or EJ. Right? We knew that there were many excellent books on CER and also about EJ. There were also many empirical articles using community engaged research for environmental justice, but there was no single volume that synthesized the CER approach for EJ. So we want to do that by synthesizing sources and show how we can conduct more community engaged research for EJ and how we can do it better. Second, we wanted to demonstrate how CER advances EJ. And based on 4 shared principles between the two, both centered local knowledge, both builds truth from the ground up, both produce actionable data that can influence decisions, and both transform, when done well, can transform researchers' relationships to communities for equity and mutual benefit. Our third goal was to establish a justice framework on how CER and EJ align on concepts of justice, and how these concepts apply on various fields of urban planning, public health, conservation, law and policy, community economic development, and food justice and sovereignty. And Chad will discuss this further in a little bit. Our fourth goal was to involve multiple perspectives and fields. Chad and I brought different experiences and disciplinary perspectives to this book project, and we recognize that anyone can contribute to research, but none can produce it alone. We recognize that knowledge is situated in individual perspectives and experience, and also produced through relations with others. So we knew we needed additional perspectives beyond our own and more collective authorship. So we reached out to early career Black, Indigenous, and scholars of color who were doing community engaged research in their respective fields and invited them to co-author chapters with us. You'll hear from them today and throughout our webinar series. Also to note, we wanted to create a book that was widely accessible. So we opted for an ebook, free ebook, downloadable. So we encourage you all to do that. Our book is based on three distinct parts. The first is Foundations, where we define and describe the development of environmental justice and community engaged research, showing why they were especially suited to each other and offering a current summary of the major literature in both topics. The second part of the book focuses on collaborations, addressing how community engaged researchers co-construct knowledge about environmental justice with our community partners. Chapter 3 summarizes the prep work and self-analysis that outside research really need to do before partnering with EJ communities to address power imbalances and bridge differences. Chapter 4 describes how researchers and partners address power relations in each of the major stages and elements of community engaged research, from sharing funding to co-disseminating findings and taking actions. Chapter 5 looks at the barriers to conducting this kind of research within higher education, related to things familiar to many of us on the webinar: control of funding and data, research ethics and evaluation, and recognition of community indigenous knowledge and interests, and how these barriers might be dismantled through restorative justice. The third part, applications, explores the way that community engaged research has been applied to environmental justice across many disciplines. This part begins with the chapter summarizing the range of research methods and methodologies often used in community engaged research for EJ. And then subsequent chapters explore how this research has contributed to environmental justice. Each chapter presents an overview of community engaged research in this domain, some by case studies, and some directions for future research. So we are pleased today to present material from several of the introductory chapters of the book as a way of introducing the material to come in the following webinars. And I'm pleased to introduce and turn it over to my friend and co-author, Chad Raphael. Chad is professor of communication and co-coordinator of the Environmental Justice and the Common Good Initiative at Santa Clara University. He has been a community organizer, funder, and researcher for environmental justice for over 25 years, including involvement with community-based organizations as well as foundations. It was there that our paths crossed and what has led us to today. So Chad.
Thank you so much, Martha. I'll go ahead and share my screen. I feel really lucky to have worked on this book with you and with all of our co-authors. It's been a fantastic experience, and I'm just really grateful for the opportunity. I'm going to talk a little bit about the first two chapters of the book and about why we think community engaged research makes such an important contribution to environmental justice research. So we're going to start with some definitions of both and what's at stake in them. And then we'll finish up by talking a little bit about why community engaged research is so important for environmental justice, especially at this particular historical moment. Let's start with environmental justice. So let's start with the definition of environmental justice that we don't embrace in order to, but which is probably the most powerful definition and most widely cited definition out there, because it comes from the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. This is what you would see as the definition if you went on their website today. And let's break it down and look at where the shortcomings are. So EPA defines environmental justice as the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people. It doesn't mention the rights of nature, which are widely recognized around the world, like the rights of rivers to flow and forests to stand. And it doesn't explicitly recognize the rights of future generations of people and other species. So it's an anthropocentric definition of environmental justice, and one that we want to broaden by drawing on more ecocentric definitions. It says that EJ is fair treatment and meaningful involvement of folks, and then it calls out what are still very much the main sources of oppression that cause environmental injustices based on race, color, national origin, and income. But we know from research that environmental injustices also stem from oppression based on gender, LGBTQ status, immigration status, disability, and many other categories. It says that EJ is the fair treatment and meaningful involvement with respect to the development, implementation, and enforcement of laws, regulations, and policies. Okay? But the whole reason why we wrote this book is that it also has to do with the research agenda. It's fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all folks in the research agenda too, because research produces knowledge, which produces power, which shapes policy choices and people's understanding of environmental justice. And so the research agenda and the funding that supports it and the very process of research is another aspect where we have to also be enacting environmental justice. The EPA definition says that we will have arrived at environmental justice when everyone enjoys the same degree of protection from environmental and health hazards. But we know those degrees of protection are too low right now for everyone, so that's not justice. And it says that the goal will be achieved when everybody enjoys equal access to the decision-making processes. But we know that access, it's easy to get access to a decision-making process about environmental issues in most cases. What's hard is to ensure that EJ groups and communities have equal influence with corporations and governments and other powerful institutions. So our definition of EJ stands on the shoulders of giants who came before us, scholars who've been thinking about this for quite a long time, but it adds a new twist, particularly in the fourth dimension. We talk about 4 dimensions of environmental justice. The first being distributive justice. That's really about who ought to get what. And that was really the main focus of the early EJ movement in the 1980s in the United States. And we think that focused on, for example, inequitable siting of toxic facilities. So here, environmental justice means reducing environmental burdens and increasing environmental benefits and capabilities for EJ communities that have for too long been saddled and overburdened with the burdens and denied the benefits, and for the earth. So not just an anthropocentric definition. In terms of procedural justice, EJ's about participation and influence in environmental decision-making by historically excluded groups, particularly in those frontline communities that are most affected by environmental injustices. And it's about protection of individual and group rights, because many indigenous communities would say group rights are primary, more so than simply individual atomistic rights, through law and regulation, enforcement, and informed consent, including informed consent to research, to participating in research, as well as siting of facilities. Third dimension of EJ has to do with recognition justice, whose knowledge and culture should be respected and valued. And here, EJ for us means respect for EJ communities' diverse environmental cultures and knowledges, the local experiential knowledge, the traditional ecological knowledge that indigenous communities have built up over millennia, and for the interests of future generations and non-human or more than human nature. And then finally, the last dimension is the one that maybe hasn't been thought about as much, more so in the last 10 years with the just transition movement. And that's transformation justice, justice in what ought to change and how. And here, EJ for us means the restoration of nature and the reparation of damages to those EJ communities from the long-term causes of environmental injustices, colonialism, racism, economic exploitation, other systems of oppression, patriarchy. And it also means systemic and structural transitions that create more just power relations, more regenerative economies, and reciprocal relations with nature. So that's the justice of how we change. And the just transition movement and reconciliation with indigenous and land back movements are really kind of good examples of where this is being worked out today. Let's turn to community engaged research. What do we mean by that? It goes by lots and lots and lots of names, and there are different traditions. We won't be able to talk about all the differences among them today, but we would certainly count the participatory action research tradition that especially emerges from Latin America and the Global South, pioneered by folks like Paulo Freire and Orlando Foz-Borda and many others. The kind of community-based participatory research tradition that's been developed, particularly in the public health fields here in the United States over the last 20, 25 years. Citizen science, or what most of us would prefer to call it nowadays, community science projects that involve communities in monitoring, for example, air and water quality. Indigenous-led and decolonial research around the world, and there are many, many other names by which community-engaged research goes in different countries. So what do we mean by community-engaged research? We make the case in the book that we should really think about this as a distinct research paradigm. When we think about research paradigms, often folks talk about quantitative research, qualitative research, and critical research as the 3 main paradigms. But we actually think that community-engaged research cuts across all of those, because CER can be quantitative, it can be qualitative. It's almost always critical, we hope it is. But maybe the kind of clearest distinction to make is between CER and an expert-centered paradigm. And we often contrast paradigms according to 3 dimensions. The first being ontology. What is real according to this paradigm? In the expert-centered paradigm, research institutions are the real primary seats of knowledge, and disciplines, our fields, are the primary governors of what counts as knowledge. In contrast, in CER, research institutions are seen as collaborators in a network of knowledge production that includes community organizations as well. And therefore, the authority over that knowledge is shared with relevant communities. In an expert paradigm, researchers are seen as expert producers of knowledge, which is consumed by or applied to communities. And therefore, research is on or for the community. In a CER paradigm, knowledge is co-created between professional researchers in academia or government or elsewhere with communities, and it's inherently action-oriented. And so therefore research is with the community rather than on or for it. In terms of epistemology, how we know what we know, an expert-centered paradigm tends to see knowledge as emerging from researchers' expertise as they apply approved methodologies and as it is vetted by the professional peer review process. Community-engaged research respects that, but it adds that knowledge also emerges from community expertise in facilitating the co-production of knowledge. There are things that communities know about how to produce knowledge that academics and other professionals don't know as well because we're not from those communities. And that knowledge is vetted not just by professional peer review, but by community peer review, which has its own additional standards for good knowledge. For example, is it relevant to the community first and foremost? Does it inform action? And so on. In an expert-centered approach, applied knowledge is typically seen as being spread by replicating best practices, often very mechanically. If something was true in one context, if some practice worked in one context, well, let's apply it somewhere else. Community-engaged research is much more aware of how knowledge is relational and contextual and local and experiential. And so it aims to spread and adapt promising practices from one community to another while respecting their differences. And in the expert-centered approach, knowledge flows pretty much in one direction. It comes from experts to communities, whereas in a CER approach, knowledge flows multidirectionally among experts and communities. Finally, in terms of axiology, what is valued? An expert-centered approach tends to value dominant knowledge systems that we've been trained in, even if they're hegemonic and colonizing. And it values community engagement to the extent that it advances researchers' goals, if it values community engagement at all. In a CER approach, it values a recognition of diverse knowledges. It recognizes that knowledge is power. It values indigenous and decolonizing knowledge. And it sees community engagement, partnerships, and participation and control of the research as inherent goods in themselves. And it values outcomes that explicitly advance liberation and equity and cultural recognition. The expert-centered approach can value, unfortunately, extractive partnerships. Researchers focus on extracting data from communities, analyzing it themselves without consulting communities, releasing it into the world on their own terms and in their own language, and also extracting funding from funding organizations that are willing to have them work on those communities. In contrast, a CER approach aims to build reciprocal, mutually beneficial partnerships that share resources and authority between researchers and communities. In that expert-centered approach, researchers' assets are valued as curing the deficits of the community, which can lead to a technocratic and vanguardist view of research. In contrast, in the CER approach, community assets are seen as strengthening the capacity for just practices and grassroots leadership by those who are most affected within the research process is explicitly valued. So community-engaged research speaks to those same four dimensions of justice that EJ does. It just speaks to them a little differently, but you can see a close relationship. And for CER, distributed justice means ensuring the fair sharing of resources like grant money and work among researchers and communities, and developing agreements and managing conflict and building capacities for equitable partnerships. And Julie and Erika are going to talk in much more detail about much of what's on this slide in their presentation. In terms of procedural justice, CER values community participation in and power to design and conduct research in lots of ways Julie and Erika are going to talk about, as well as control over the data. Recognition justice in CER means recognizing the validity and differences among the local, experiential, and indigenous knowledges I've been talking about in defining the community and its representatives. And transformation justice means changing how we all do research together, collaboratively disseminating results and implementing actions to repair and restore and create just relations with EJ communities and nature. So why is CER so valuable? And why is it especially valuable now? The main argument we make in the book is that Community-engaged research makes a unique contribution to environmental justice by advancing justice through the research process, the means by which we do it, not just through our findings. And we think that EJ is best served when communities exercise power to co-produce and control their own knowledge so that it informs and influences the decisions that affect those residents. That's always been a hallmark of the EJ movement. We speak for ourselves and we know for ourselves. And so that's where CER really makes this unique contribution. It honors the EJ movement's desire to speak for ourselves. There are some other reasons that have been highlighted, particularly by Balash and Marilla Frosch, and we're going to add a fourth one that doesn't get talked about so much when people talk about the 3 R's of community-engaged research and why it's valuable. The first is relevance. When we work with communities as professional researchers, it really grounds the research agenda in community concerns rather than academic trends or things that are not as relevant to communities. Community-engaged research can also add rigor to the process because community partners are capable of identifying research sites and populations that often academic researchers are unaware of, and they're able to help build the trust necessary to earn access to those sites and populations. I really want to underscore earn access to them. We don't have an inherent right as professional researchers to get that access. Community organizations can also increase the sample sizes by reaching more people, response rates to surveys and interviews, and participation in interventions and treatments by being ambassadors for the research and recruiting. And the process of ground truthing, checking up on official data or filling in the gaps in official data from a local perspective, walking a community oneself to see where the toxic materials are or how many fresh fruits and vegetables are available on the shelves in the bodega. All of that ground truthing can correct and enrich what data is out there, and it can also add new ways of analyzing it by bringing in contextual and explanatory knowledge to help explain why things are happening the way they are. The third R that's often talked about is reach. Community partners help to disseminate knowledge way beyond academic journals to diverse audiences and translate that knowledge into useful tools that can influence practice and policy and organizing. Fact sheets, testimony at city council meetings, things that make change. Also increases reach by building an active user base for the research. People who participate and the organizations they belong to, when they participate in this research, they're also creating themselves as a user base for that research. They're going to translate it into local languages and lay terms. They're going to involve participants in implementing their findings. The fourth R is one that's talked about less. We think it's really important, and that's reflexivity. When academic or government researchers collaborate with community organizations, that interaction really helps to clarify the research agenda. What is it that we really want to know, and how can it be relevant to the community? What's the nature of research? It introduces new kinds of research ethics, and it challenges some of our existing research ethics. And it also clarifies, most importantly, the purposes of research and whose interests it serves. That this is not just to get tenure, okay, or to fulfill a government grant or an obligation that's written into the law. It really helps us to get very, very clear about why we're doing what we're doing. Why is community-engaged research so important today? What can it contribute to environmental justice at this moment? You may have heard that we exist in a communication environment that involves new and powerful ways of spreading misinformation, and that trust in institutions, including academic experts, is very, very low among many, many people, including in EJ communities, who have some good reasons, frankly, to mistrust researchers, given the mischief and harm that we've done over the years in Indigenous communities, in Black communities, and so on. When community people are involved in research, they're more likely to believe it and act on their findings because they're their findings, not just ours as professional researchers, much more so than if they're asked to be passive recipients of expert knowledge. Experience isn't always the best teacher, especially if it's experience based on prejudice or a narrow view of the world. But experience can be the best teacher if it's the experience of doing rigorous, meaningful research in collaboration with others. And then in terms of communicating environmental justice, source credibility matters a lot for our research these days. Community-engaged research is the story of environmental justice that people tell themselves in their communities. And so for even for people in the community who weren't directly involved in the research, they get testimony from people like us, however they define that, who have done that research and who can vouch for it. And that's a powerful teacher too. Now, at this point, some of you may be wondering, particularly if you don't do a lot of community-engaged research, okay, are these people saying that community-engaged research is the only legitimate approach to environmental justice research and every other kind of research is illegitimate? And the answer is no. We are not saying that community-engaged research is the only legitimate approach to environmental justice research. Many kinds of research can contribute to our understanding and advancing of environmental justice. Literature reviews that help us understand, or meta-analyses that help us understand the state of the field and what we know and what we need to know. We being communities as well as professional researchers. And many of these kinds of research, and there are many other kinds as well, right? Performances, cultural performances, etc. They can also be necessary preparatory work that helps build academic researchers' understanding and community partners' trust that we actually know enough and care enough to be worthy partners with them. And then obviously not all situations are right for community-engaged research. Either the community or the researchers may not be ready yet to partner. They may lack awareness of environmental justice or a strong commitment to collaborate. And there's a lot of preparatory work that one of the chapters in the book talks about that researchers need to do in order to get ready to do this kind of work. If there are intolerable risks, if this research would pose intolerable risks to community partners and researchers' health and safety, which is a concern in many areas of the world, right? EJ research offends the powerful, and the powerful can be dangerous. And then finally, if the community has research fatigue, many indigenous communities, for example, are tired of being studied, and feel that their energies would be best spent elsewhere on community organizing, for example, or advocacy, or personal healing. If the community has too great a level of mistrust of researchers, if there's a lack of representative organizations that can actually speak for the community, or if the community partner prefers to delegate research to others who they know and trust, that happens too. Or, as is often the case, that community organizations in the EJ field can just do the research themselves without the help of outside researchers, or they only need them as very junior partners, as sub-grantees on an award, because there are plenty of EJ organizations out there that have very strong research capacities, and they really don't need academics stepping in telling them exactly what to do. So I'm going to stop there and ask Martha, if she would, to unmute and go ahead and invite and introduce Julie and Erika.
Great. Thank you, Chad. I'm very pleased to introduce our first presenters of our webinar series, Julie Lucero and Erika Marquez, to talk about their chapter on the community engaged research process. Julie is at the University of Utah College of Health, where she is an associate professor of health and kinesiology, co-director of graduate studies, and the associate dean of equity, diversity, and inclusion. Using mixed methods and community-based participatory research, Julie's research is centered on the identification of modifiable social determinants to reduce the impact of health inequities within marginalized populations. She has been involved with community-based participatory research projects in collaboration with American Indian, Hispanic, and LGBTQ communities. These projects examined factors associated with substance abuse, mental health, positive youth development, and service utilization. Erika Marquez is an assistant professor in the Department of Environmental and Occupational Health at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. Her research focuses on health disparities with an emphasis on the built environment and system-level influences that result in inequities in health. She has devoted the last decade of her career to working on local issues focused on housing quality, housing-related health concerns, and housing equity. Specifically, she has examined the impact of lead as an environmental hazard in children through direct efforts to improve housing conditions using surveillance data to inform public health decisions, and has embarked on using an academic detailing approach to engage providers as a method to increase blood lead testing in children. She oversees the implementation of the One Community campaign focused on conducting education and outreach to vulnerable communities in Nevada, hardest hit by COVID-19, using a community-based participatory approach. She oversees and co-leads the Nevada Vaccine Equity Collaborative, which provides a statewide forum to strategize vaccine outreach in the hardest hit communities across the state. This work involves mapping data with a social vulnerability index to guide on-the-ground community efforts. Julie and Erika, turn it to you.
Thank you so much, Martha. This has just been an absolute pleasure to work with both Chad and Martha and Dr. Marquez. And so we're going to provide an overview of our chapter, the Community Engaged Research Process. This is just a quick overview of what we'll be discussing with you today. Community engaged research process, the dimensions of justice, data to action, and participatory evaluation. I want to pause just for a second and take a step back and say, welcome to everybody. Good morning to those in Hawaii and Alaska, and good afternoon to those of us in the rest of the US. Thank you so much for joining us. So, Chad had provided this table to you as a quick overview of some questions that we could ask as we're getting ready for or just starting to engage in our research partnerships. So really at its core, CER partnerships are partnerships or relationships between academic and community members. And they come together as around action. So all of the things that need to happen in order for a partnership to progress are really around this action component. And you could imagine that in any relationship, there really are power issues at any step in that relationship development process. And so when we ask ourselves these questions, such as the distribution dimension of justice, who ought to get what, then we're already starting to develop this shared decision-making process around whatever the topic is, how we're going to address the research, what is appropriate for community. And so starting out by asking these questions between the community and the academic partners is really going to set us on a path towards shared decision-making. So first, we also need to really think about who is community. When we talk about community in these relationships, what does that mean? And so defining community is that powerful decision that really makes us think about who are we inviting to the table to be part of this project and who are we excluding? And is that really going to get us where we want to go? And so it's also examining assumptions about who belongs, right? That inclusion, exclusion, what does the diversity of the community mean to our project? And oh my goodness. That's what happens when I get too excited with my hands. So then the definition of community also, the community may be defined in very different ways. So based on geography, occupation, race, ethnicity. So for example, a rural EJ project, maybe an EJ project among physicians as an occupation, race, ethnicity, we know that that is really central to environmental justice and many other factors. And also thinking about what is meaningful to those community members that is not typically what we consider to be part of community. So in Indigenous communities, for example, they may include plants, animals, and ancestors. In this schematic, this really builds on the different types of justice and the questions that are asked within those different cells. So this is a schematic of the research process, starting with ideas and issues and really defining what it is that we're going to be investigating, and then the process all the way to action. And all along the way, you can see that there are points where power can rear its head. So either it is asserted as power over or asserted as power with, which is what we are really trying to do within community engaged partnerships. And so the first issue is how decisions are being made, what knowledge is being privileged, and a lot of this is really echoing what Chad had already mentioned. To what extent are partners involved? There's been criticism around community engaged research where partners are really only involved during data collection and dissemination. And that is something that we want to move away from, so that issues and ideas and issue definition is where communities are and academics are really coming together to start that shared decision-making process. And it's continuing all the way through. Also, the idea of who approves the research. So there are lots of different approval bodies rather than just institutional IRBs. So the institutional research boards. There are research review boards. There are community review boards. So really understanding community and who is responsible for reviewing the research in order for us to move forward. And then what are the risks and benefits of just raising a topic? Not so much doing the research, but just raising the topic. So think about, issues that are really sensitive, such as suicide. What does that mean for a researcher to raise the topic of doing research around suicide? Are the designs and methods appropriate? What are the risks and benefits of the research? And then ultimately, who benefits from the research? Just to take a step back on the risks and benefits of research, we typically think of psychological or physical risks, but there are lots of others. If you think about the 8 dimensions of health, what are the risks around any of those dimensions? Spirituality, financial, legal. And so really exploring what does it mean for this research in terms of community health overall. Finally, as we're getting closer to action and data collection and analysis, how are data being collected? What is being done with the data? Who owns the data? And we'll talk about that a little bit more in a second. And how are data being interpreted? Who's being invited to interpret the data? And is there action around that interpretation? So that then feeds into where is knowledge being shared? What happens with new knowledge? How is knowledge being shared, and are the data actionable? If we go back to the very start of my presentation, where community and academic partnerships are coming together around action, this is the ultimate outcome. It's a starting point and an end point that may start another cycle of the partnership. And I did it again. Okay, another point of these relationships is that, as with any partnership, any relationship, conflict is going to happen. So rather than waiting to create solutions or actionable items when conflict does occur, it's a good practice to start figuring out what are we going to do before conflict occurs, and how are we going to address conflict when it does occur. Oftentimes, we think about conflict as a bad thing. It's a bad word. But really, when we encounter a point of conflict, it's something that we can then have a really rich discussion around. And then when we come out on the other end, we are stronger for that conflict. And so here in this schematic, there are different issues that are well documented reasons for why conflict arises in community engaged research. So governance, again, who owns the data, who decides and approves the data, coordinating collaboration, whose job is it to do that? Oftentimes it falls on the community side and they already have a job. So we don't want to add anything more to that. Communication differences, so how we say things, jargon that we use in our professional life is also a power mechanism. And so balancing research and action, research needs to benefit all parties involved. And then really differences in worldviews and ways of knowing. And Chad touched on this very, very well. And then finally, in the book chapter, we have this table, and I'm not going to go through all of it. There's a lot of information here, but it really does just give you more information about the reasons for conflict that were presented in the previous slide. A description, so more detail about what that might entail or how conflict might arise, and then ways of addressing it, and then provides you the references if you want to go to the original article. And then finally, for me, before I turn it over to Dr. Marquez, are considerations during the research process. So having community advisory boards can help with community oversight, guidance, and co-decision making. Community advisory boards have been criticized by only providing advice, but they can be set up in very different ways. So in my research, I like to include the research in this title, so community advisory and research boards. So not only are they advising and guiding, but they're also actively involved in the research process. The second consideration is capacity building for research partners. So while partnerships are coming together because of action, they're also coming together because of research. Research is a means to get to that action. And so community capacity or capacity building is something that is really lacking in the literature. And so, but we know that we need to build skills for all partners, not just community partners, when we're going to be, going through the process. And the foundations of environmental justice have done this. It's just part of environmental justice. And it's something that we can really learn from as we're moving research into other spaces, research space, so on and so on. Project funding and budget sharing. This is often a means of conflict where the university partners or academics are getting compensated much better than community partners, whereas we're asking community partners to do a bulk of the work. And so really figuring out what that budget sharing is going to look like and who's going to be primary is critical for these partnerships to progress. And then finally, agreements and roles and responsibilities. So you could imagine that project funding and agreements could go hand in hand. So memorandums of understanding or MOUs, memorandums of agreement, often define expectations. We can also create data sharing terms. So that gets back to the who owns the data. And then of course, control over the finding, who gets to interpret and who gets to share, and what information needs to stay with the community. So that is all for me. So I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Marquez.
Hi, thank you for having me. It's great to be here today. Next slide, Lucero. There we go. All right, so I get to talk about from data to action. And this part is really exciting to me. So I'm really glad that I got to cover this in this lecture. But one of the things, I guess the title kind of makes it seem like data to action is something that we do at the end of our work. And the reality is it's something that we actually have to start talking about in the beginning. And really because, when we're engaging our community partners to think about what is relevant to the community, we also have to equally think about what are the expected outcomes? What are the impacts that we intend to have related to this work? And so we have to begin to be prepared to have conversations about what that might look like. And so that could be environmental impacts. It could be policy impacts that we want to have, or impacts on practice or programs, or even for academics, it's always important to think about how we're advancing the science. So we don't have to, the nice thing is that we don't have to pick just one of these categories. And oftentimes in community engaged work, we aren't limited to this, right? We can pick from a multiple of these to help us decide what we're going to work on and what data we need to collect to be able to achieve those anticipated impacts or outcomes that we want related to our work. And so this becomes integral at the beginning, at the onset, when we're having community partner conversations, to think about what, again, the relevant issues, but also what are the relevant impacts related to the work that we could do in collaboration, because then that helps inform what data we collect, how we may analyze it, how it's interpreted, and again, how it can be actionable at the end. Next slide. Now, evaluation in general tends to take a top-down approach, where the evaluator tends to be, an independent observer, very focused on making sure what we do in evaluation, right? That we're accountable to our funders. Now, what participatory evaluation does, in addition to making sure that all the beans are counted to make sure we've met the deliverables and the metrics that we said we were going to do, but participatory evaluation adds to the dynamic is that it ensures that the values and the priorities to the communities we're working with and in are incorporated. And in that process, they help us define success. They help us define it, they help us measure it, and more importantly, they help us figure out how do we achieve that. And that becomes a really important part of participatory evaluation. Next slide. Now, many of you are probably familiar with the overall evaluation process, from formative stages to summative stages. But one of the things I get asked really often is, how do I maintain and sustain relationships? And when I kept thinking about this as we were writing this chapter, I thought about it was really the integration of our partnerships in the onset, from the beginning to the end, of how we thought about how we either evaluate, or you can substitute here research, right? We were able to validate their contributions. And the way we did that was incorporating them in the process of helping us figure out not only what to work on, but how to work on. How to work on it, how to implement programs, how to implement interventions. And oftentimes, and we talk about this a lot, and because I try not to approach my partnerships with just my title, but oftentimes I'm perceived as the expert. However, more often than not, I leave learning so much more from my community engagement, from my community engagement efforts, about how to better implement our work in the communities by considering context and by considering the cultural relevant methods and interventions that we should use. And that really comes from talking and engaging with communities that are living in that community. And so I think whether this is an evaluation process or a research process, this is where it becomes integral in sustaining and maintaining and sustaining our relationships with our community partners. Next slide. And, I think one thing that we think about, I know we're like, you'll have to have some type of dissemination plan and thinking about how are we now going to share information. And, this is, again, something we still have conversations with our community partners at the get-go to begin to at least set a framework of how we're going to build awareness, create understanding, how we're going to drive action. And that's good to have like an idea of where we want and who we want to communicate things to. Now, your communication and your dissemination plan may not be as fine-tuned until you start getting into the interpretation of your data. And this is where, for me, I think it helps me develop an understanding, not only for research purposes, but what information of all the data we've collected and all the stuff that we've interpreted, what matters and who does it matter to? And so then you begin to refine this communication and dissemination plan to really hit home on what information you're going to share, who you're going to share it with, what formats are you going to share it in, and what methods are we going to deliver this communication to, right? So we are going to now tailor absolutely all of our interpretations to fit the audience and the needs of those audiences. And that is, it's going to be kind of like a working document, something that's going to evolve as you collect data, as you interpret the data, and as you work with your community partner to figure out what are the best formats, types, and methods of dissemination. Next slide. And just to kind of bring us full circle, so what are some of the things that you should think that are important, right? Is a commitment to engaging and addressing power relations. And it's a process. It's a process to learn how to do that and how to negotiate that. And depending where you are on the spectrum of community engagement, that process is going to evolve. And as you maintain and sustain these relationships, that will get easier. Be prepared, as Dr. Lucero mentioned, be prepared to manage conflicts. they're going to occur. And again, as she mentioned, conflicts aren't necessarily a bad thing. They're actually a great thing to figure out how to come to a resolution, how to reach consensus. And it doesn't mean necessarily always 100% consensus, but how do we continue to refine our work so that it still maintains relevant amongst everyone? Remembering to collect data that derives community action. This also helps to support building and sustaining relationships and also building and sustaining change in the community. So these are all integral to those building partnerships, making sure our findings are disseminated in inclusive ways and into all those that are invested in our work. Engaging partners in assessing success through participatory evaluation. And every research decision, of course, has implications to the dimensions of justice. Thank you so much. Next slide. And that brings us to our end for Dr. Lucero and I.
Thank you. Thank you, Julie. Thank you, Erika. We have a few minutes before the end of our webinar today to take some questions. I think looking here at Chad, I think there's one there for you around sort of the limitations of CER. And then there is a question or a comment about the involvement of community partners in some of maybe your dissemination practices, right? And presentations of data and such like that. So maybe we have Julie and Erika share a little bit about that, the role of community partners, and then we'll end with, and then we'll move to Chad and the question about some of the limitations of CER.
Sure. Sure. Why don't Erika and Julie go first?
So generally, Erika and Julie, you know, what's the role? What has been your experience in the role of community partners in disseminating data? Maybe give some examples of that.
Yeah, so interestingly, Erika and I just submitted an article yesterday, and we had eight authors, and 5 of those are community partners from a coalition that we're a part of. So for me, it's really important to get community partners to participate as co-authors or co-presenters, just because they're doing the work and they need to get the credit for it, just as we would expect from anybody else. Dr. Marquez?
I was trying to unmute. Yeah, we have used various. So I think the important thing here is that some of the dissemination isn't just about the peer-reviewed literature, right? Our community partners have helped us disseminate tons of information, from infographics to mailers or understanding that none of those paper methods also work, right? So in some of our vaccine equity work, where we funded our community partners to help tailor the messaging, but also they help support understanding the best method of communication. And flyers and things like that were not the best method to be able to counteract a lot of the misinformation around the vaccine. And it really had to tailor our adaptation of how we shared information based on what the communities needed. And so sometimes it is word of mouth and dissemination. Sometimes it is infographic type stuff. Some of it is phone call based. It really depends on the needs of the community. And they have helped. We've had them support from peer reviewed publications to direct on the ground, boots to the ground information in the community.
You want me to take that other question, Martha, that you mentioned? Okay. So this was a question about reacting to the limitations of community engaged research, and was asking, when would non-CER approaches be appropriate, or some other kinds of approaches as well. In terms of non-CER approaches being appropriate, I had mentioned lit reviews and meta-analyses that can help identify key issues and help communities understand how comparable other communities are responding to them. That could inform a CER project in that community. Or law and policy analyses that analyze the impacts on health or justice. For example, the research that's been done on the shortcomings of the California cap and trade policy which, even if it brings down greenhouse gas emissions across the state, isn't reducing local air pollution in overburdened EJ communities. Scenarios planning that project future impacts of climate change on flooding and fire in a region, and areas that would be most affected. That could inform a community engaged research approach to our resiliency study. And then if you think about all the historic research, health research that's been done on the impacts of diseases on different populations, identifying who's most vulnerable, for example, to particulate matter or lead, that's kind of basic research that we can do on new environmental threats that can help inform community engaged research on how to address those threats in particular communities. So those are a few examples.
Yeah, great. There's a couple questions that are being popped up around the challenges of funding and some sharing funding. So let me ask all three of you, perhaps, examples of budget sharing, right? And how you navigate funding that may be more interested in funding traditional top-down hegemonic type of research, right? So I don't know who wants to start that one.
I know, for example, that some of my colleagues at Santa Clara have applied for California EPA funding, and they've applied as junior partners with community organizations. So the community organization is really the primary applicant and recipient, and then they contract with my colleagues and their students to provide particular inputs on the research. And I think that's a really welcome development in funding circles, that Cal EPA and others are really kind of looking to community-based organizations to be the primary grant recipients.
And I think the only thing I would add here is, and I think there is a lot more funding opportunities that are allowing for a community, a shared powered sharing approach, right? And I think the big thing here is that there are going to be some where it is going to be a traditional method, but you can still use community engaged process in it. And I think that's the nice thing about this being kind of a spectrum based on your FOA. It may be because of that funding opportunity that brings you together, but for other opportunities, it may not be. And so we intentionally try to look for opportunities that help bridge that partnership. Again, it's about, for us, trying to maintain and sustain the partnerships that we have so that we're not going into the community and then say, okay, we're funding gone, we're gone, right? So we're trying to always look for those opportunities that support community engaged research. But if they don't, and they still align and are relevant, there's usually still opportunities to make sure that your partners are funded under those even top-down approaches.
Great answers. Seizing the moment of the last 2 minutes here. There's a couple of questions about how do you find your community partners, right? So, right, coalitions. How do you find people to work with?
Take a stab at it. Fortunately, we have really great. How do we find partnerships? And I think if you get the slides, there's a citation of a book that we just, a workbook, a toolkit we published on community-based participatory research where we cover this more in depth. But honestly, it's about finding someone that's working in the field that it's relevant to your work is really the first thing to do, is pick up the phone and give them a call, tell them about your work, and let them tell you about what they do. And then you guys look at where can we find commonality? And that's really the easiest step to approach, but you can engage your coalitions, engage other organizations that are doing similar work and just start getting connected.
There's many other questions. I will say that in the service of trying to wrap up at our 1 o'clock at the hour here, we have a number of other webinars that are coming. Let me just say, I would invite people to join us at some of these other webinars. They feature a number of other co-authors who have been academics. I'm going to try to share my screen again. Who are academics, but also who have been community partners in the past turned academics. And so I will, so you can see here, if I can, there's a QR code here to register for the next set of webinars. They'll feature some of the co-authors of our book who are certainly researchers in academic institutions and also sort of centers and advocacy organizations, many of whom have been community partners in the past and now turned academics. And so we appreciate, we're going to be hearing from all of them in the next few weeks. We hope that you'll join us in those. Our next one is on the 15th. And please register, and please don't buy this book. We want you to download it for free. The QR code is in the lower right corner of your screen. So thank you all so much for joining us today. We look forward to seeing you on the 15th and in our subsequent webinars.